So, अब ये पूरी Monsanto की कहानी है. So it's about how Monsanto worked with the government and Shehbaz Sharif was almost going to sign something and then backs out, being scared that he'll be dubbed as a Monsanto agent. Now over 100 varieties of BT cotton and corn without any trials have been approved by the government in February 2016. And this is where the story ends, as the GM seed is here without any evaluation or risk assessment. I have another quote in the study which talks about how US aid, this is from a person we interviewed, said that they can also introduce now GM rice in Chicago. Right? In a landscape like Pakistan, where we are so eager to please development organizations, even regular, I mean, an aid agency cannot come and tell you कि आपका law ये होना चाहिए. But USAID की website पे लिखा है, we have advised the government on the Seed Act of 2015. Right? So it's not उनकी website पे. So it's not a coincidence that it will promote US seed, right? And I have no problem having a choice of seeds, right? I have access to US products living in Pakistan. The issue is how, the issue is through what means, the issue is at what cost. At what cost, not just to me, but to farmers. In its cotton belts, because there have been more than 650,000 farmers' suicides over the last 12 years there. 650,000 farmer suicides. अभी बहुत debate होती है कि वो drought की वजह से है, कि वो water की वजह से है. But a lot of evidence points that it is also related to the fact that BT cotton just doesn't deliver the productivity miracle, right? And it leaches the soil as well. And you don't have the indigenous variety to fall back on. At least there they have a lot of support for community seed banks. So seed banks are spaces where you preserve traditional seed. And I had the good fortune of visiting such a seed bank. It's really small. I wish I had a picture. And seeds are this small, and they do miracles. I just एक variety आप में ना, I can actually easily preserve 1,000 varieties in this bookshelf. Right? If you think about what power seed has and what seed banks can do, but we don't even go there in our narrative. So finally, the person tells us. All the stakeholders are Monsanto's friends, the All Pakistan Textile Mills Association, the scientist community, the academia, the media and journalists, who is then left to resist. Our scientists have specially played a very important role in inviting this technology in, क्योंकि आपको मरात मिलती है, right? There's a whole support structure. And I want us to ask this question, who is left to resist if you've also colonized the resistance? Next. Okay, so I think I can stop here and Rafe can talk at length about the laws and then we can have a conversation. So you can just... Thank you
very much. I'll take up from here. Thank you, Michelle. That was incredibly informative. You are what you eat, comes to mind.
Rafe, what was your presentation called?
That's a good question. There it is. I'm going to talk about the experience we had going to court regarding genetically supposed to do, how Pakistan has developed a legal framework for GM operation, and then give you a brief case study of how the BT case has gone along. And please have a seat. We can clear that. Also, painfully aware that I'm a lawyer and I can speak incessantly. So I will try then to put the brakes on and speak briefly about the Seed Amendment Act and this plant breeders' rights bill that's also almost about to be passed. Next, please. Okay, so next, the GMO regulation in Pakistan. I have all these sort of animations in my slides, so you're going to constantly be pressing again. There we go. That's a confusing graph or chart that describes what the environmental regulatory framework in Pakistan looks like. At the very top, this is the environment regulatory framework under the Environment Protection Act of 1997. It envisions Environment Protection Council at the apex with the Prime Minister, the Minister for Environment, the Chief Ministers, provincial entities all represented, that will set environmental policies for the country, policies that will be implemented and enforced by a Pakistan Environment Protection Agency, And then the provincial governments in each province can set up their own provincial environmental protection agencies, all of which regulate the public with respect to the environment. There's a role of the federal government and provincial government and tribunals as well, but essentially we have an environment protection agency in Islamabad that's supposed to regulate environment federally, and then provincial EPAs that do it within the provinces. Next slide, please. What is the role of the EPA and the government? The role of the EPA is to police emissions, review and approve environmental impact assessments for new development projects, regulate the import of hazardous waste and substances, automobile pollution, and if there's an infraction of any of these things, to issue environmental protection orders. On the other hand, the federal government, next slide, or next button, has under the law the power to delegate its authority to the EPA. Whatever responsibilities the government may have with respect to the environment may be delegated. It has the power to give directions to provincial entities. Please do this. You can direct the provincial environment protection agencies to do specific things. It can make rules, amend the schedule, and approve regulations. So you can see that the role of the EPA and the federal government, or the old Ministry of Environment, is distinct. The regulator enforcer is on one side, and the sort of rules and policy maker is on another. Next slide. So, how do we do it? Genetically modified organisms in Pakistan are controlled by international law. And that mechanism is provided for in Section 31 of the Environment Protection Act, which gives the federal government the power by notification to make rules for carrying out the act. Next slide. We have 14 different rules. I'm sorry, the print is very small, but this one in red over here is the Convention on Biological Diversity, passed in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. This is the international agreement to which Pakistan is party that governs also something called the Cartagena Protocol with respect to genetically modified organisms. So one of the agreements that the federal government can regulate is an agreement with respect to genetically modified organisms. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. And so, the government of Pakistan, since 1997, in exercise of its rule-making power, it can make rules, has made all sorts of rules, but only one rule regarding international agreements. So it has tribunal rules, certification rules, sample rules. The biosafety rules of 2005 are the rules the federal government made under the Convention of Biological Diversity to regulate GMOs in Pakistan. Next slide. Okay, so what we have is the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which is a protocol of the Convention on Biological Diversity. The Cartagena Protocol is the international sort of framework for how GMOs will be treated. Can you press the next button? I'll read what Article 1 of the Cartagena Protocol says. It says that in accordance with the precautionary approach contained in Principle 15 of the Rio Declaration on Environment, the objective of this protocol is to contribute to ensuring an adequate level of protection in the field of the safe transfer, handling, and use of living modified organisms. This law refers to GMOs as living modified organisms, resulting from modern biotechnology that may have adverse effects on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So, technology is a good thing. We just want to have a system that makes it safe and secure and precautionary when we're using it. So that's the function of the Cartagena Protocol. Next slide. Now, Pakistan made the Pakistan Biosafety Rules in 2005, and they apply to the manufacture, the storage, the import and the export, the testing of genetically modified organisms in Pakistan. So, in following the objective of the Cartagena Protocol, the biosafety rules set out the mechanism by which GMOs will be regulated, by which licenses will be granted, and subsequent to this, another button, the National Biosafety Guidelines were passed. This is a very hefty 250-page document that gives anyone interested in working in genetically modified organisms the ability to look at the forms and applications and requirements necessary to obtain permission to either test or to commercially use genetically modified organisms. I have to stop here and say genetically modified organisms encompass far more than just food security and so on. It has repercussions in medicine, in all parts of humanity. It is technology, and like all technology, in my opinion, it's benign. It's what use you put it to. And like all technology, we must be aware of it, we must be precautionary, we must know what impacts, if any, are adverse to us, so that we can use this for the benefit of everyone. Next slide. So what do the biosafety rules do? Set up a very elaborate structure, because as I said, GMOs cover anything from cotton to tomatoes to splicing genes, making, I don't know, what was there was that goat that they, not the sheep, yes, Dolly the sheep. So all sorts of things. So because there's such a vast subject matter that can be covered under GMOs, the way that licenses and approvals are granted is actually structured. So the first step is having institutional biosafety committees in any institution in Pakistan that does biosafety research. So these are people on the ground doing testing and providing inputs. Next slide. And they provide inputs to something called the Technical Advisory Committee of the government. This Technical Advisory Committee looks at this very different type of information and sees whether or not it fits the guidelines and the procedures necessary for considering approval of a GMO. And once the TAC is done, the application goes up to something called the National Biosafety Committee, which is the final authority mandated with the responsibility of doing something called risk assessment and reduction. For any GMO to be passed, whether for testing or for commercial use, the test under the Cartagena Protocol is risk assessment and risk reduction. It's more or less analogous to the requirements of an environment impact assessment, the EIAs that we're familiar with, you know, the Orange Line and all the other construction projects, where in a development project you're supposed to do expected environmental harm and then environmental mitigation. So you assess the harm and then you provide mitigation steps. So similarly, the National Biosafety Committee, for whatever type of GMO application is coming up, has to see what the risks are and then try and do a risk reduction if it's necessary. The membership of the Pakistan Biosafety Committee is these bunch of people. At the very top, the Ministry of Environment. I want you to remember that by law, the convener of the National Biosafety Committee is an official designated as the Secretary of the Ministry of the Environment. That's the black and white letter of the law. No other person can convene the NBC. And all sorts of representatives from federal institutions. And there is some debate about whether or not representation there is properly democratic, whether you should have farmers groups there, whether there should be provincial representation. But those debates are not germane to this issue. I've already talked about the role of the NBC. It considers applications for import, export, commercial release, and so on. It can also have bans and restrict the imports of certain types of GMOs. Next button.